Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney O'Connell, and we are here with the live Q&A with author and entrepreneur David Passiak. I am your host, Courtney O'Connell, and today we'll be discussing my favorite topic, which is disruption. We'll be talking about David's latest book, Disruption Revolution. We got it right here. Everyone should get their copy. And pick his brain about all things disruption, innovation, and how we can be empowering agents of change. This interview is part of the 5 Habits of Innovative Educators eCourse, an eCourse devoted to helping educators learn the habits of innovation. I am the instructor and curator for the course, along with about a dozen guest lecturers. If you are not already enrolled in the course, I have good news. Starting tomorrow, July 23rd through July 30th, you can save 50% on enrollment. So be on the lookout for that link starting tomorrow. Throughout our broadcast, please, if you're watching live, use the hashtag InnovateEd, and that's with only one E, so InnovateEd in terms of innovate education. So use hashtag InnovateEd to live tweet and ask any questions for David. And we'll be looking for those, and we'll be asking your questions. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about David, and we'll get right into it. So David Passiak today, he is a former religion scholar turned technology entrepreneur. He has held leadership positions at prominent tech startups. Also, David served as senior director at M80WPP, where he ran social media for Volkswagen, including launching their Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and VW's first company blog. He is founder of Social Meditate, an innovation and strategy consultancy. In 2013, David published Disruption Revolution, a book that represents the culmination of 20 years of research and professional experiences focused on disruption, and is also a follow-up to his first book, Red Bull to Buddha, Innovation and the Search for Wisdom. That is actually just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to David. So I will actually let that lead us into our first question for him. So David, let's begin. If you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and your latest book. And also, you have a new gig, I know, that just recently started. So if you want to talk a little bit about that too, that'd be great.
Sure. So yeah. So first, thanks for inviting me to join you today. I think one of the interesting things about innovation is a lot of times people are drawn to these things that are kind of new or sort of on the fringe, often sort of years before other people. And so when I look back on my career, I started off as an aspiring academic. I did a master's at Arizona State, followed by PhD studies at Princeton, and I studied religion and culture. And a lot of people hear religion and culture, it's basically within the context of the university, it's a study of worldviews. So I looked at primarily from the 60s counterculture and civil rights movement up to the present, and I started to track how these trends kind of emerge and grow over time. And I think I was interested in that stuff before anyone was really talking about word of mouth, social media. There were no social networks. This was back in the 1990s to early 2000s. And then I started to really kind of see these trends of people starting to blog, and YouTube was just kind of starting to gain popularity in the early 2000s. And I really started to feel like I didn't want to be sort of in the ivory tower, so to speak, studying these things. I wanted to actually kind of be part of those. So I moved to New York, started working in before social media, started working in kind of word of mouth online marketing, and then basically got to the point where after like 2008, 2009, I was working in an agency at the time, and after the economic crash, I started to see all these kind of people starting to rallying around this term disruption, and I think basically this idea, I think particularly after like the TechCrunch Disrupt conference came out, you start to see these shifts from like traditional print and television media shifting into social. and at the same time, analytics and tracking tools started to get much better. And so what I started to see was what I would refer to as I started to see people rallying around this term disruption, saying, I'm disrupting this market and I'm disrupting this industry. And in many ways, they didn't even have a product out yet, right? So they weren't actually disrupting anything yet, but disruption became this kind of term that they were rallying around. And so I started to see what I referred to in my latest book as a disruption revolution, right? This idea that there was this sort of collective belief that the old way of doing things was somehow outdated in different industries, and there was a way in which technology, and kind of fueled by social media and mobile in particular, was kind of fueling this revolution of innovation across all these different industries. And so to sort of backtrack a bit, my first book looked at sort of like I think some of the reasons behind why the economy crashed, in terms of like overspending and sort of going beyond our kind of people living beyond their means, and some of the things that kind of led up to the crash in the first place. And that was much more about finding a balance between traditional conceptions of community and wisdom, and kind of disruptive innovation. And so that book was Red Bull to Buddha, and that kind of drew upon my religious studies background, as well as I've been practicing meditation for about 20 years as well. And then the latest book, Disruption Revolution, I wanted to take what I referred to as a wisdom of the crowd approach. So I realized that it didn't make sense for one person to try and tell this story. What it made sense to do instead was to talk to people that are sort of on the front lines and get their own kind of perspective on the changes that are happening. So I started to kind of reach out to people within my network, and then slowly started to gain traction with these interviews. And I was fortunate enough to interview 23 of some of the most remarkable and interesting people in the world. And it was almost like what I would refer to as kind of like my own innovation MBA type of course. It was a really amazing experience to spend to spend that much time, and to have to go on this journey with some of these incredible innovators. And so in the spirit of one of the themes that came out of the book, and one of the kind of the emerging trends right now, in the spirit of the collaborative economy, I invested almost all of my savings in doing this book. I worked on it full time for about 6 months, and then instead of trying to sell it to a publisher, we decided to give it away, and to make it available by donation. We actually were talking to some publishers, but the thing is that the way that the publishing world works is that a book will come out 9 to 12 months after it's finished, and that of course is like a lifetime in the scope of innovation. So we eventually decided to self-publish. And it's been really cool in the last 6 months or so since the book's come out. Just the response from people all over the world, and I've had a lot of different speaking opportunities, a lot of opportunities like this, and so that also eventually led to my new role. So it was funny. I was walking home one night, and I started getting I get email notifications when someone downloads the book. So I start getting all of these like this flurry of email downloads at about 2, 3 in the morning. Some friends had taken me out to celebrate that the book was finished and had done well. And it turns out that it's from this site in the Middle East called Dubizzle. Dubizzle is actually the largest peer-to-peer marketplace in the Middle East. And that led to a series of conversations, and where their head of marketing basically said, in your book, you've kind of articulated the vision that we have for the collaborative economy, and what we want to accomplish over here. And so within a matter of a couple of weeks, I got an offer and ended up moving to Dubai. So it's been a really kind of interesting journey. Since I've been here in the last 2.5 months since I've been here, I've had speaking opportunities in Portugal, went to conferences in France, went to Qatar, Oman, Egypt, and it's been really kind of an amazing journey. And I'm really kind of excited to be here. It's really interesting. You know, I think one of the most interesting things about this part of the world is that it actually in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and UAE, some of the adoption rates of mobile and social media are the highest in the world, even higher than in the U.S. And yet there's a variation in terms of the adoption rates of different platforms. So, for example, Facebook is really big in Egypt, whereas Twitter and YouTube are very big in Saudi Arabia. So it's been really kind of I'm really excited to be in this new role because it kind of combines my all the stuff I was doing with innovation with the things that I did in my PhD studies in religion and culture.
No, that's awesome. Sorry about earlier. My mute button was still on, and I'm like, little technical glitches, you know. But no, I love some of the stuff that you're saying. I mean, it's really interesting because when you're talking a little bit about disrupting without a product and how a lot of that was going on with the, 10 years ago or so, I see that now even. Like, I have a few friends that have ideas but don't really know what it looks like. They know that it means disruption, but really not knowing what the product is or how to explain it in a way that, how can you get it to that 140 character explanation. And so I can totally relate to, and I think it's helpful for those listening or tuning in. If you feel like you know that there's something wrong and you're trying to fix something, you're not the first one to kind of struggle with that. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Totally.
The other piece too about publishing is so interesting, and obviously I work with Eric Fallman, and he did a hybrid model as well in working on his last book, and it's been really interesting in terms of being able to own the art, which is really cool too. There's obviously you get rid of the lag time that you talked about, but you also get to own the art. You're not worried about, you can, like you said, you can give it away for free, or you can do certain things that are really neat. So so I wrote some notes on it here.
And of course, Eric is in the book as well.
Yes, that's right. It's a good interview. Very interesting, actually. In terms of the interviews, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves because we will talk about some of those. But yeah, that was one of the things that I found. Even Eric's interview and some of the other interviews that you do in the book, you start to see a different side of folks. Like a lot of the people that you interview, they have their shtick, right, that they normally talk about. But some of the stories that they shared in your book was really interesting because they shared something that people may not even know about if they, depending on how much they know the person or reading their work, or even if they've seen them speak a few times, you kind of illuminated some new stories and new perspectives that I found was really interesting. So,
yeah,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, it was such a, I mean, it was just it was such an incredible journey doing the book, and getting I felt really kind of blessed and fortunate to be able to ask all of these incredible people, basically whatever I wanted. It was really awesome. I think you mentioned Eric Qualman. One of the I've given a few workshops on the book, and one of the things that people always can keep bringing up is this idea of failing fast and failing forward and failing better. And I think that his interview, I think, particularly when I'm doing leadership type workshops, really seems to resonate with people.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my favorite quotes from your book is in the very beginning when you say there are extraordinary opportunities for people with the courage to be remarkable. I thought that was awesome. Can you elaborate a little bit on that statement? Like, what do you mean by that for those that are watching?
Yeah, it's funny. I gave a workshop last weekend in Lisbon, and afterwards these two women from Nigeria and Kenya kept going. I have the courage to be remarkable, and they just kept talking about that, and that seems to resonate with a lot of people. I think the basic idea behind that is that we're kind of trained to do marketing or to do our professional lives to follow this kind of strict route, right? Where you have your career and you have your bullet points, and you have to you're applying for a job and you have to make sure everything matches the qualifications that people are looking for and stuff like that. But I think that what you find is that today there's so many people competing for the same jobs and competing for attention that you really need to kind of stand out. You really need to do something that's kind of remarkable. And really, I think the only way that you do that is to try and just be kind of unique and creative and kind of distill what you're thinking down to the very essence of who you are. Like, what are the, it's that quote initially, that phrase initially comes from Seth Godin, and in the interview with him, he says something like, you have to be you, but no one is going to be interested in you just because you say that you're you, right? There has to be that one kind of unique thing that makes you stand out, that draws people to you. And so there's this idea in terms of being remarkable. I mean, you just have to you have to really kind of, I think part of it is being kind of really introspective and thinking, what is it really about me that makes me stand out? And then Seth also has this idea that when you're afraid, sometimes fear is a sign that you're really onto something. And so there's this tendency, like, you get afraid, and that fear, I think that fear is telling you that you should be conforming and you should be being like everyone else. But actually what you find is when you let go of that fear, and he says that you dance with it, when you kind of dance with that fear and really kind of try and push ahead, then that's when people really start to take notice of you. And so this idea of being remarkable, it's really, I think it's really kind of a way of being in the world.
No, I love that. And I think for those, obviously, this is where I love the idea of talking to folks like you and bringing it to educators, because that's such an important lesson that we need to be sharing with our students. Like, this idea of embracing fear and dancing with fear to be remarkable. And really, it all goes back into, immersing yourself in the discomfort. And those are all really important lessons that educators are constantly working on with students. So I appreciate your sentiment around that, because I think it's helpful for those that are working with young people.
Yeah. Especially when you're teaching in an environment that's so focused on grades and performance and testing, right? That's when all of your metrics are around kind of conforming to a certain level of standards. It's really kind of important to push through that message of being unique and remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So my next question is, you talk a lot about the rate of change only getting faster. You even mentioned this too when you're talking about the publishing of the book, and how a 9-12 month lag time in this era is something that changes everything, right? So in the book, like I said, you talk a lot about the rate of change only getting faster and faster as we continue to evolve as a society. In your opinion, what types of people or organizations do you think thrive in this kind of environment that's moving really fast, and what can we learn from them?
Well, I think it's really important that for companies to kind of define who they are in terms of their values, and I think that. I think for the core, especially for kind of the core leadership within an organization, you need to have a sense of what your purpose is, what your why is. Why do you get up every day and come to work? What are you doing? Because I think when things are changing so much in the external world, it's important for you to have kind of a really kind of solid foundation to lie back upon. What Eric actually in his interview in the book refers to as their North Star, right? What's that kind of fixed thing that when the world is constantly sort of changing and uncertain, the thing that you can kind of look to and aspire to and work towards in terms of a common goal. And at the same time, I think in terms of values, you also need to be willing to kind of let go of attachments to preconceived ways of doing things. And you also, I think it's also really kind of important to put in place processes and kind of feedback loops to integrate information and feedback from people, to integrate that back into your organization, to integrate that back into your teaching plans, to integrate that back into your messaging. That can be really tough to do, but I think there's a lot of kind of great tools. I think that there's ways in which you can use social media and different monitoring tools and keeping up with trends, and then integrating those back into lessons or integrating those back into the way that you operate. Because I think there's this sort of basic idea that when the world is constantly changing, you want to be proactive rather than reactive. Because if you're constantly just reacting to things, it's like I feel like it creates this vicious cycle where you're reacting to things, so then you're anxious, and then you're scared, and then everyone's kind of tense in the workplace, and then next thing you know, everyone hates coming to work, right? So you have to, there's a way in which you kind of have to accept that the world is constantly changing, and this is just how it is. And if you have kind of your core values in place, and you're willing to kind of accept that you have to test things and you have to learn from your mistakes along the way, if there's kind of a culture of openness that allows you to have that freedom to fail and to learn and to grow along the way, I think that ultimately those types of organizations are the ones that are able to adapt and grow faster and faster.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it all goes hand in hand, right? So no big organization, and most of the time in academics, you're talking about a big organization, whether you're part of a school or a district, or you're talking about an institution, and obviously a comprehensive organization. And the only way to thrive, like you were saying, is knowing your why, and everyone knowing it. Because how can you be proactive in any situation if you don't know at the end of the day what the why is, the shared why? Otherwise, we're always reacting. So yeah, I mean that's a great point, and it's helpful for us to kind of think about when we're faced with those situations on our campuses or in our schools. If we're going into the school year, what is our why? And does our supervisor think the same thing? Does the teacher down the hall think the same thing? Are we all on the same page? So I think that's really helpful in terms of framing, because obviously as educators, we may not be in the most fast-paced industry, but the truth of the matter is our students are living in a fast-paced world, and we're part of that. So we need to be able to react.
I think that another thing along those lines, specifically related to teachers, is that technology and innovation becomes the most powerful when we stop thinking of it as being technology, and it just kind of becomes something that we do. And so I think that one of the challenges that I think teachers might have is that their students tend to be very kind of tech savvy, and they spend their lives on their phones and their iPads and online. And I think there may be a tendency to among teachers who might not be as technologically savvy to be a little hesitant to use technology or stuff in the classroom, or to think of it as being something kind of disconnected. But actually, for their students, it's just part of their daily life. I mean, people don't think, I'm going to go on Facebook and do this. They just kind of do it, right? And they just pick up their phones and they seamlessly go from talking to someone to messaging them. That's just kind of the direction that everything is headed. Mm-hmm. And so I would encourage teachers to think of ways in which you can make lesson plans or learning a little bit more interactive, and to think of ways in which you can kind of integrate things that students are already kind of doing in their daily lives into your course plans and stuff.
I think you just got a collective amen from a lot of educators out there that are with you on that. But I would agree that that's not the majority. That's probably kind of a small, growing grassroots minority of us that are like, yes, we're on
Yeah.
board. But yeah, no, I think you're right, and it's tough because when you look at educators, I mean, we're starting to see millennials entering the workforce and digital natives entering the workforce, but it's such a wide variety. And so, when I talk with whether it be my parents or even folks a generation or two ahead of mine, I can understand that there's a disconnect there in terms of just not all the time, but a lot of times just understanding what you just said. I mean, Facebook is just it's just an extension of a lot of young people's identity, or Twitter, whatever it is. And so there's definitely a learning piece involved there, and I think there's a lot of folks that are interested, and for those that are guarding the status quo and not interested, it'll get to a certain point where it'll almost have to happen, like any disruption. So that's a great point about technology and even social technology in education. So
Totally.
we'll keep moving along with our questions.
Okay.
So this is good. This kind of gets us back to the interviews. So in your book, you interviewed an all-star cast of innovators, as you've mentioned. Which interview surprised you the most in terms of a surprising story or message you didn't anticipate hearing from that particular person?
I think the thing that probably surprised me the most was the interview that I had with Jerry Colonna, where he has an interesting background. I mean, some people have referred to him as the Yoda of Silicon Alley. He was Fred Wilson's former business partner. He was a very successful VC, and then after running a fund for in kind of the first .com bubble, he kind of phased out and has transitioned into being a life coach. And he's in his personal life, he's also has developed a kind of very extensive meditation practice, and he works really with leading entrepreneurs on the psychological challenges of entrepreneurship. I think one of the hardest things about being an innovator and an entrepreneur and doing kind of disruptive things is that it can be kind of a lonely journey. You're doing something that hasn't been done before, and you're kind of blazing a trail, and you're trying to tell you're trying to sort of listen to your instincts and do what you think is right, but at the same time you're doing things that may not have been done before. This book in many ways was, I saw this book as an extension of the entrepreneurial work that I've been doing, right? I just started doing I was like, I'm just going to do this book, and I started getting traction with the interviews, and I kept going and going, and I found that I spent about 3 months total full-time doing the interviews, and about halfway through, I had all of this kind of fear and uncertainty about, because my fear, of course, was, what if one of these interviews goes wrong, right? Because I'm interviewing some of the most influential people in the world in innovation, and they all know each other. And it was like I only needed one of them to go bad, and someone would go, who's this David guy, right? Like, who is he to, why are all these people spending time with him doing this book? What's going on? And so I had this fear, probably about 6-7 weeks into the whole journey, where I had all of the interviews confirmed, and it was like, I was like, okay, I just have to kind of get through this. But it was a really kind of amazing experience, and I interviewed Jerry about halfway through, and if you read the interview, there's a point where he starts talking about fear, and he basically says, watch, I'm going to call this out. And he just kind of like, so the whole the interview shifted where he started asking me questions about disruption and uncertainty, and it was really it was unexpected for me because it was like oh yeah, like it's he's drawing all of these kind of fears that we all share. They really kind of came up within the context of the interview, and it was really, I think it turned out to be one of my favorite interviews in the book for that reason, because it felt really kind of engaging, and I felt like I really kind of grew a lot in going through that experience.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It's like coming full circle. Like earlier, you're talking about dancing with fear, and here's like a perfect example of how
Yeah.
you lived what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is awesome, because if you're gonna, that's the type of thing, if we're going to encourage anyone, whether it be students or whoever, our colleagues, to be disruptors or to try new things, take risks, you have to back that up with your own experiences and your own you got to live through it to be able to then be there for the next person that kind of goes through it. So that's a great example.
Yeah, and of course, educators. It's like the biggest fear, right, is getting in front of people and doing public speaking, and it's like that's what teaching is, right? That's what education is all about, is getting up in front of people every day and telling them what you think is right. So I think what you'll find is that the people that are working with you and taking this course, that they're going to be constantly confronted with this. And I think it's similar. It's important to have it's important to remember that fear is kind of a natural part of this. And if they weren't, I would be concerned if there wasn't any fear involved in terms of doing things that hadn't been done before. But then similarly, it's important to have kind of a supportive network of people that are kind of helping you and kind of nurturing you as you go along as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it kind of goes back to the values, right? Having the shared values.
Yeah, totally. I guess along those lines, so the course is really focused on habits of innovation. So trying to demystify this idea that it's all about the wow factor, all about the production value. Innovations definitely can have those things, but really it's about, innovators approach their work differently than other folks. So there's certain habits or approaches that they're using, and those are teachable. And if we can just learn those, that's kind of what's around. I'd be curious to hear, like kind of going along some of these interviews, what are some common traits or themes that you found in each of these interviews? I'm sure as you went along, you're like, I heard that before, or I don't know if there's any kind of themes or traits that kind of came out as you were interviewing all these disruptors.
Well, I think when you look at the people that I interviewed in the book, I don't think that any of them did what I think they were all successful in their own respective career paths. But money and success wasn't kind of their goal. They were just sort of naturally curious, and they kept doing what they thought was the right thing based upon the choices that were in front of them. And I think that's the thing that I would say is kind of the core trait that kind of links all innovators together. It's not Einstein and some guy with a crazy hair who just kind of comes up with these like ideas and all of a sudden the world changes. It's really not like that. I think actually the process of going from an idea to actually getting it into the world requires a lot of discipline. I use the book for an example. I spent about a year I came up with this idea, there's this disruption revolution. Well, how am I going to tell this story? Well, there's this kind of I think there's a 4-part innovation process that the book is based around, right? You identify sort of external trends, and so that's kind of the front end of the book around 3D printing and social media and wearable technology and entrepreneurship around the world and stuff. And then there's a section on like core leadership and your values and kind of how you define your core organization, which we were talking about earlier, and then you have to put into place processes and tools that help you to scale. And so you start to think through, like, I mean, I'm trying to relate this to education. Like, you might come up with an idea, and then you sort of take a step back and say, well, how can I translate that idea into a bunch of lesson plans, and how can I take those lesson plans and break it into individual exercises that kind of build upon each other, right? And then so there's a whole, when you think of teaching innovation, or you think of teaching in an innovative, or educating in an innovative way, it's a whole series of processes. And I think that when you think particularly about trying to pass on these kind of lessons to students, you have to, I think it's critical to teach kids that it's okay to fail, and it's okay to kind of experiment. I gave a talk, I gave a presentation a couple months ago to a high school class, and the kids were just kind of blown away by this idea that it was okay to fail, because they had been taught all their whole lives, I have to get these good grades so I can get into a good school, so I can get a good job, and that's just kind of the path that they should go. And I think most students kind of have that mentality. And from the flip side, the reality is, I don't think that innovation is for everyone. I think that I don't think that the world that everyone should be out there trying to innovate. It's actually really kind of hard. I mean, they wouldn't call it innovation if it was easy, right? Because the whole idea around innovation is you're doing things that are completely kind of new and different. And so, but if you think of this idea of innovation being a process, right, there can be the people that are coming up with these kind of breakthrough ideas on a team, and there are the people that are supporting them, and the people that are kind of helping to test those things. And so you have to look at innovation in kind of this holistic kind of way, and see where you kind of fit into the picture, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. A couple of things. You bring up failure. We've had a lot of conversations, at least in the part of the course is to develop specifically to talk about failing. And then also we've had a lot, just people have been blogging and talking about it on Twitter and that kind of stuff in the education space. And it's so tricky, right? Because so much of what we do is about this piece of accountability and have you learned what we've taught you and that kind of stuff. But then there's the other side of, we're living in a world where you can find information so quickly. And so really teaching the critical thinking skills of failing, learning from failure is so important. And so I think we're at a little bit of a crossroads as it relates to old school meets new school, and how are we kind of adapting to the new world, because the ability to fail fast and forward, as I think you said earlier, and as a lot of other innovators talk about, is such an important trait now, and yet the old model of education really isn't designed for that. So it's going to take a little bit of a paradigm shift, but I'm glad you bring it up, and I think again, a lot of this is reaffirming to folks that are believing in that and trying to incorporate it, because like you said, pioneers get pushed back is something that I know Eric says a lot. And so for us that are trying to talk about it and make more room for failure, it's always good to hear we're not crazy. This is happening in a variety of different industries and in different ways.
I think the thing that's hard about the particular challenge that educators have, and I think this is more broadly as well as people in positions of government as well, is that the traditional disruptive innovation model, right, is that an innovation comes along and then the incumbent, and then they just kind of crush the incumbent, and then the new model of innovation pushes forward. But it's not like you can just fire the principal and everyone moves out, right? So the challenge with innovating within education is much different than the challenge of innovating within a marketplace, because you can't just crush the competitor, right? It's like you have to figure out ways to we've
He froze up a little bit. Oh, sorry. I don't know if I cut you off. You had said it's a different
no,
challenge.
I saw your face freeze, and so I wasn't sure if you had lost me.
I think we're good. But yeah, no, I as to what you're saying, the challenge is you just pretty much summarize part of my TEDx talk from last August, and a few of my posts that I've written too. I mean, it's such a different challenge. The similar, the cycle of innovation that occurs with a product is very different in than the cycle of innovation, or I don't even want to call it a cycle. It's just a hot mess of innovation, and how it occurs in education is just so different. So definitely, like I said, the conceptual pieces about hearing from folks that failure is part of the process and those types of things, that's why those are important for crossover. But how we deal with innovation in education is going to look so different than how innovation exists in other places. So again, it's always good to hear that from other people, not just kind of hear it from the same people in education. Kind of hearing it from the outside is also good too.
Well, I think that innovation acts like training wheels for larger shifts in behavior. And so what I mean by that is, like you think of like a simple cell phone, right? And you're holding in your hand this device that you can access any piece of information in the world. You can call anyone that you want, and you can you connect with anyone through all these different social platforms. And that really kind of brings about a broader, just that kind of experience of being connected. It kind of changes the way that you orient yourself towards the world. And I think that to sort of take a step back and you look at some of the shifts over throughout history, like you can't, for example, look at the '60s counterculture or the civil rights movement independently of television and radio kind of reaching mass adoption in the '50s and '60s, or even going back to like the early rise of nation states in Europe and the printing press. Like there's a way in which when you can access information in new ways, it changes you. It leads you to think about your values and your place in the world and your community and things that go on in daily life. And I think what you find is that when we kind of look back at these kind of patterns in the past, is that the real changes tend to occur once innovations and how we communicate have kind of reached mass adoption. And so I think that the next kind of 10 to 20 years for education are going to be kind of fundamentally disruptive and transformative, because the next wave of teachers are going to grow up using mobile, and they're the digital natives, and they're out there wanting to get jobs, and they're not dealing with they're not dealing with people that are administrators who are still having trouble sending emails and getting online, right? It's like there's a fundamental shift that's going to kind of happen, and you have to, I think if you take a step back, there's a certain sense of inevitability with this. I mean, it's going to happen, and I think that I'm sure everyone that's taking your course is going to be kind of the trailblazers in this area.
That's the hope. But there's a lot of folks out there, which is great, and that kind of leads me to the next.
I mean, I'm super passionate about this stuff with my background in education, so I'm super. I'm
this
excited.
is awesome. It's like a very thought-provoking conversation. I could probably talk to you for hours.
Good.
What's that?
I said good.
Awesome. All right, so I want to try to get on to some of these other questions I know that we have and people have kind of come up with and submitted and that kind of stuff, so I want to make sure we touch on a lot of them. But so I guess, all right, so when reading the book, it's very important, it's very apparent that the workforce landscape is evolving rapidly. What advice do you have for educators to best prepare students to enter this workforce that's rapidly changing?
I think the best advice that I would give is to tell students to be kind of public in asking their questions in terms of like have a blog or be active on Twitter, or you need to have something, or get a Tumblr account, or whatever it is. I think it's really important to have some type of sort of public record that kind of shows that you're interested and passionate in whatever you want to do, because the biggest challenge that a student is going to have when he or she is graduating and trying to get their first real job is that they don't have any real experience. And so they're in a position where all they have is their GPA and a couple of internships, and there's really nothing to make them really stand out. It's really kind of hard to stand out trying to get your first job. And so if you're able to submit your resume and say, and look, I have a blog and I've interviewed people, or I've done this or that, a hiring manager can click on that link and all of a sudden it brings you to life, and you're not just another of 100 blind resumes that have been submitted. There's like it communicates your personality and your passion and your character and your genuine interest, and you can show, if you've been writing or doing stuff on Twitter, or you've been active, you can show something comparable to work experience, right? Because you've taken an initiative in terms of trying to be a thought leader and do something that's kind of interesting. That also demonstrates initiative. It demonstrates the types of initiative and character and drive. Those are all the types of things that an employer is going to look for when they're hiring someone who's fresh out of school. And so I'd say that's probably the most important thing, is to think about creating encourage kids to create a public record of things that can demonstrate their competency of getting a job.
Totally. Yeah, when I was working at Rutgers, I did a leadership class, and as part of that, the students had to blog. There are a lot of folks out there doing that, but not a lot of them are necessarily putting it out on like an actual WordPress blog. There's like Blackboard has like a blog part of their class or whatever, different online tools. But I would agree with you. I think the more public we can help our students put their digital reputation out there and put their message out there. I mean, we can always help them along the way to craft that in a way that makes sense or is going to really make them look great. But again, going back to the failing fast, failing forward, that whole blogging piece or whatever it is, creating that digital reputation in a very public way where people can look you up online and find something, as opposed to looking you up online and either finding the stuff other people put out about you or nothing at all. I mean, obviously the option of finding stuff that you've created and is about your message is always good, and that's where we can kind of come in and help students do that and really put out their best foot forward. Because like you said, you're going to get some like internship and that kind of stuff experience, and you're going to develop skills. But really, in this digital age, we have such an opportunity, or students have such an opportunity that folks didn't have 10, 20 years ago. So I'm glad you say that, and I think that's great advice for students, like graduates, and also educators in terms of helping our students.
And of course, all those things are free, right?
Right.
That's the one thing, students don't have any money, but anyone can create a blog or be on Twitter or social media, right? So it's like, yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. So we are coming towards the end here. Okay. So I'm just going to ask one last question.
Okay.
And that is just in general, I mean, what advice, I know you've talked a lot about a lot of different things, I think, advice that will hit a lot of different people in different ways. But overall, I mean, given all of your different experiences with disruptors and interviewing them and being a disruptor yourself, and kind of obviously you have a good sense of some of the challenges we're up against in education as disruptors, what is your biggest piece of advice? Like what kind of What advice do you have to empower those that are being disruptors and change agents in education? What could we be doing, and what advice do you have for us?
Well, I think you need to be mindful of the parameters that you're working in, right? So you know, for example, if you have standardized testing, or you have certain goals, or you have certain things that you have to hit, you need to be mindful that's why you're there, and there are certain standards that you may not agree with, or you may not wholly buy into. But I think that ultimately you have to, there's sort of a baseline of performance that I think is kind of expected in terms of hitting these certain goals, that you need to be mindful of, and so you can't don't try and resist the tendency to throw everything out. And so I would encourage you to do that, and then, you know, you think of something like, you know, Google's 80-20 rule. Like, maybe it's, you know, 80% of the time you're doing the things that kind of hit on the core curriculum that you have to get by, and then the other 20% of the time is doing things that are kind of a little more innovative. I think also, you know, in terms of developing curriculum, I would encourage you to have as many kind of interactive assignments. I think it could be interesting, particularly when you're getting with you know, students who are very active online. You know, asking them to go out and discover their favorite blogs, or their favorite videos, their favorite examples of lessons. I think I think for me, in terms of learning, adding an element of discovery to learning is really kind of, you know, really kind of teaches you and kind of reinforces things. So, you know, I mean, I did this book of interviews. I mean, you could add, you know, require everyone to go out and interview someone, or there's ways in which you might do an interactive project where each person is contributing. I think it's really it's really important to teach people, like, how to work together and collaborate and team building and stuff. I think one of the biggest challenges in education is, like, it's like every student has to be their own individual person, and so there's this tendency to just think, if you have 50 students, you have to teach 50 individuals, and you never break them into groups, and there's no social component to learning a lot of times in the classroom. And I think that's a big problem, because I think when people graduate, they go from this, like, model of kind of living in a silo and learning on their own. All of a sudden they have to collaborate with people, and they realize when they graduate they haven't learned any skills that are kind of practical for the workforce. And so I think you know, I almost feel like you should try and, like, I mean, it's kind of a nerdy word, but, like, try and reverse engineer what are the skills that people are going to need when they're actually out there, and then think of exercises and lesson plans that help to teach those within the context of whatever you're doing. So it could be, you know, requiring people to speak. It could be requiring people to do group exercises. I mean, anything along those lines.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, and I think you bring up a really good point about, in the very beginning, you talked about not trying to throw out everything and being mindful of our environment. And I think, you know, I just wrote a post I think it was last week or the week before, about being the positive disruptor. Education is not going to change from a bunch of people coming in and saying everything's wrong and we need to change everything and everything needs to go. I mean, that's demotivating. It definitely isn't motivating at all.
My battery's on 1%. Hold on, let me plug in my power.
We can't lose you now. I'll keep talking and we'll wait till you get back. But yeah, along the lines of what you were just saying, I think the piece about just really being open to other people's ideas and being open to the constraints that we are in, and not necessarily always feeling like we have to stay within those constraints, but being mindful of which ones are most important and which ones can we poke the bear and that kind of stuff. I think that's really important. But yeah, along the lines of just being that positive disruptor, that's really key. And it's great to hear you kind of echo those points and when you said earlier. And I think the interactive piece too. We have so much technology, and the world is flattened. So interviews with people, you know, that are around the world, or innovators, or whoever, those types of things are now possible because they can be done over Hangout or you know, over email or whatever it is. So rethinking some of old ways of doing things and finding new ways to add interaction, I thought that was a really good point too. And always, and the reverse engineer is always, it may sound nerdy, but I think for some of us, we're like, that's kind of cool. I like that. But really looking at what, like we were saying earlier, what does the new workforce look for and look like, and how can we achieve some of those skills? I know there's a lot of folks working outside the classroom in student affairs and things like that that are already doing that. So I think it's good to hear, again, the validation piece of, okay, cool, like we're not just spinning our wheels here. These skills like teamwork and collaboration and things like that that we're working on in, you know, clubs and organizations with our students and leadership programs, we're not just doing it to do it. We're doing it because this is what the new workforce looks for. So all really helpful points.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I mean, I think another kind of related thing there is that you know, we're born, I feel like we're born kind of innovating, and you know, like you first start to walk, and then you fall down, and then you get up again, and you know, as you keep growing up, you're constantly learning new things and trying new things. And you know, depending upon where you're at in terms of teaching, you know, like if you're teaching college students, for example, they're at this point in life where they're just starting to kind of define who they are. And I feel like there's something about innovation and making the transition from being like a teenager to an adult that's really such a formative, critical time. And so I think that, you know, just being kind of a little bit more sort of honest and aware of the life change and where people are in terms of defining who they are, you know, the students. I think, you know, thinking about stuff like that, and designing courses and workshops and lesson plans that kind of acknowledge that critical sort of turning point from being kind of a kid to an adult. It's really like that's an age that is just kind of inherently innovative, right? You have to go from testing yourself to, like, you know, just really kind of trying to be confident, and really like there's something about that period in life that I think is really kind of interesting. You know, this is sort of an aside, but I think that, you know, a lot of times when you look at academics, I feel like there's like career academics. There's sort of like two different types. And I think there's a lot of career academics that come up with their best ideas when they're in graduate school, and when you look at the rest of their career, they may write 8 or 10 books and publish 100 articles, but they've all been kind of elaborating on that same idea that they had in their 20s. And the really innovative academics are the ones who, when they finish a project, they go on to something new, and then they go on to a next thing new, and they're constantly innovating and changing and challenging. And, you know, even within academia and education, like, I feel like those types of people are really rare. And so I guess maybe the last kind of piece of advice would be, you know, you can never be too old to learn and to grow and to continue to kind of innovate and do new things and to take on new projects. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I like it. And with that, I think we will wrap up because we're at our 2 o'clock mark. I have a few things. Your first order of business, if you're an educator, is get this book, Disruption Revolution. I think I was calling it Disruptive Revolution all week, but Disruptive Revolution by David Passiak. A lot of really great stories, and like we said, David interviewed 20, 25 different disruptors, and there's just so much to learn from what he found across the board of all these different interviews. So I hope you take a look at this to continue that lifelong learning we were just talking about. In addition to that, and along those lines, I will be tweeting out with the hashtag InnovateEd. I'll tweet out a link to find the to the book, so you can find where to get it from. In addition to that, also next week, to keep this learning going and keep talking about innovation and leadership, we will have another live Q&A session. Our host will be Tony Duty from Rutgers University. And our special guest will be Liz Wiseman, the author of Multipliers, and she has a really exciting new project, new book coming out this fall she can talk about. So that should be a really interesting conversation as well. Thanks for all of you that tuned in live. If you thought this was helpful, I hope you'll share the link with a colleague so they can watch. The broadcast is recorded and will be always available on YouTube and on my website, gordoconnell.com. So thanks again for tuning in. Thank you so much, David, for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here and sharing your wisdom and your thoughts and perspective on disruption and all things innovation with us. And with that all being said, we're gonna tune out. We're gonna end our broadcast. And thanks so much for watching.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye.